Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. I'm Todd Landman. In this series, the Rights Track is on the road, capturing the voices, experiences, and knowledge of people around the world who are part of the global coalition to end modern slavery by 2030. In today's episode, we're talking about how to mainstream the voices of the poor and the marginalized in the fight to end modern slavery in India. Earlier, I spoke to Pradeep Narayanan and Anusha Chandrasekharan from Praxis, an NGO which takes a participatory approach in its efforts to democratise development and end poverty. I started by asking Anush about the NGO's work.
So Praxis is mainly a development support organization. We use participatory methods to try and get the voices of very vulnerable, marginalized communities to different forums to ensure that their voices are heard in development processes.
Because a lot of development processes are top-down,
yes,
a kind of we-know-best approach,
yes,
and you don't involve people that are actually meant to be the main beneficiaries of a program. So
yes.
How do you do that? How do you get people to participate?
So the idea is mainly to identify within any community group who are the most vulnerable and who are the most excluded. Because even among excluded communities, it's not a monolith. For example, if you're talking about a Dalit community, within them, Dalit women would be more marginalized than the others. So the attempt is to ensure that their voices also get heard, and they get an opportunity to talk about issues that matter to them.
That's great. Could you just, for our listeners, explain what you mean by Dalit? Because maybe some of them won't know what that is.
In India, we have the caste system.
Yes.
Dalit happens to be among the four varnas. They are actually outside the caste system and four varna system, and they are considered as untouchables earlier. And even now, the practice of untouchability gets followed in different ways. It's an illegal thing.
And you have a rough estimate of how many Dalits there are in India?
So around 17% of Indian population, minimum comes from the Dalit.
And the current population of India is over 1 billion people.
Over 1 billion.
How many?
Over 1.2.
Oh, 1.2 billion, yeah. So 17% is a large number of people. Yes. And how do you reach into the communities to work with that particular group?
So over the period, at least in the last 70 years since independence, the Dalit community has reached to a different level in different areas into it. So at some places, while if you look at the poverty data and all, you will find most of the population is from the Dalit community. The community has also, it's not like community is isolated. So we do work with community, and very clearly there are hamlets over there in different villages where the Dalit population is high. And actually in the last 15 years, there is a lots of urbanization which has taken place, lots of slum towns. So lots of slums are now actually populated with a lot of Dalit communities. In that way, it is not about access to the community which is a challenge here. It is actually how to get their voices into various policy platforms, not through us, but they themselves getting into the platform is a major challenge for now. So that's how we try to organize what we call it as ground level panels, to actually voice against high level panel recommendations. So when they talk about their own issues, so we use various audiovisual methods like participatory videos or digital storytellings,
yes, or
directly community leaders talking to the policymakers, creating that kind of spaces is something which we look at it as an access.
So you talked about urbanization. Is there a lot of internal migration of the Dalit population? So they come from villages into the cities, but then they populate, for lack of a better word, the shantytown areas around major urban centers. Is that right?
Right. A lot of them actually, the Dalits do migrate to a different place. And if you see in India, the modern forms of slavery, actually in India, it comes out very clearly because what is caste system at the end is in a feudal form is about a judgeman who is a upper caste dominant, who is a landowner, and there is a Dalit population which used to work for them, and that was at that time and even now is termed as slavery, but the laws legally these are called as a Bonded Labor Act. So in 1976 we got the Bonded Labor Act. Now if you see the same system over there also, what used to happen at that point of time, traditional conventional form is they used to support the agricultural laborers, Dalit community, through various forms of giving them various kinds or cash at various points of time, so that they work for them on a permanent basis. Right? There is no fixed wage. There is nothing like that. They just work for them based on various things which comes out. Now what we see in the modern forms also, almost a similar thing, where workers, Dalit workers or any worker who is bonded actually gets a lot of advance money to just be there in the workforce. And in fact, some of them do even get the money as advance even for them to come later on, right, in the next round of it. So in that way, the entire system, which was earlier there in the agricultural farm, has now actually migrated to even in the various kinds of manufacturing concern, where the same kind of a thing exists that way.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about bonded labor, in the sense of why is it considered bonded, and this notion of anticipatory pay. So this notion of advancing money with the expectation that someone works. And, that people have this conception that if you're not being paid for your work, that's the extreme form of forced labor or labor exploitation, modern slavery, etc. But how is it different? What is this notion of bondedness?
The version that you spoke about also exists, where people are forced to work and not get paid according to the work that they have put in. You find a lot of that happening in specific industries, especially brick-in work, where bricks are made. Within the communities that these people belong to, they do not have access to easy, safe loans. So in case they encounter any kind of an emergency, or if there's a wedding in the family or a death in the family or some kind of illness, the existing infrastructure, like for example the health infrastructure, is not good enough for them to be able to access good quality healthcare at a low price. So they end up going to private hospitals or private facilities for which they require a much larger sum of money than they can afford to pull out at one time. In such cases, they end up taking advance loan. So interestingly, when brick-in owners come to give this advance, it's usually around festival time. So because they know that there'll be a lot of expenses around that time, and once they have made these expenses, they need more money or more sources of income. So around this time, you will find these agents go to different hamlets, they already have identified who the vulnerable families are. And they go to them with this money, and they say that they have some work opportunity that they will have to get back to within 3 to 4 months. So the idea is that because they have been paid that money, they have to go there and work it off. Pretty bad in terms of the long hours of work, the kind of labor that they have to put in, not being allowed to leave the place of employment. Yeah, sometimes there's also abuse in the form of physical as well as verbal abuse, and sometimes sexual abuse of women.
So the advance pay creates an obligation to work. The hours, conditions, etc. of that work are nowhere near what these people have actually been paid, quite apart from the fact that you wouldn't accept pay and be abused at the same time, etc. But it also, in a sense, gives license or permission to the person who has paid to carry out further abuse on these people.
Exactly, to use them in whatever way they feel justified.
And equally, this notion you said about they're not free to leave. Can you tell me about that? What happens if someone tries to leave their place of work?
So there are different kinds of things that happen. For example, if it is in a brick-in, which is very close to a village where the person is living, there is a form of physical violence. So they will come with the goons that they have and ensure that these people just get back to work. Sometimes there are things like threat of say that if you are not able to work, or if you're not able to come to do the work today, send your child. Or send anybody in your family who is available to do that. Yeah.
And they have to probably do it for one person.
Yes.
Right? Rest of the workers, once they see it happening to one person, that threat gets manifested in terms of fear for them. Right? So
it becomes a deterrent in that sense. Yeah.
So and so therefore it continues. So therefore it doesn't. So therefore, if somebody goes and investigates, you may not be able to find out that this threat exists in that form, in a real form, mostly in the form of a fear, which is another challenge which you have. And you have a situation where the bonded labor themselves don't feel they are bonded, and these kinds of invisibilization of threats exist. So it is often challenging for many of us who are working in this area to help them out of this kind of bonded scenarios.
And I'm interested in that invisibilization that you talked about. And also one of our podcasts was with Austin Choi Fitzpatrick, who did a lot of field research in India talking to what he terms as slaveholders. And one of the insights from his study is that there is at the village level or local community level an almost cultural acceptance of this practice. Exactly. Could you say a bit more about that? That, someone could sit in a village circle and say, well, that person is my owner or my holder. That's a real thing?
I can just give you, because this happened almost 2 years ago, but it's still fresh on my mind. So there was this lady I was talking to in a hamlet in Bihar. And during the conversation, she was telling me about how when she goes to work at this zamindar's place, besides the work that she goes for, which is mainly related to agricultural thing, she's forced to stay back and do a lot of other household chores. So when I asked her, what do you protest or something, she said something very simple: I do it out of love. I do it out of love for the zamindar. So wow. That is a kind of thing. And she said it so naturally. And it was a very spontaneous response, nothing that she thought about or... So for her, he is like a provider, like an all-in-all, who is providing her with the money when she's going to do work. And if he actually tells her to do some extra work, why not? So it's that love for,
But it creates a situation of labor exploitation and free labor in that sense.
Yes.
But it also raises bigger sort of intellectual questions around false consciousness and, so how, do you do things around education, for example, raising awareness that actually this is quite unfair. How do you do that and break that? Because if she does feel love for her holder, how do you say, well, actually, have you thought about, how do you approach that challenge of awareness raising?
One of the programs in which we are working with Freedom Fund, with their partner areas, and with IDS Sussex, what we tried to do was form an action research group within the community. So that group is actually not necessarily discussing about bonded labor or slavery or anything, but they just first collected the case stories and then they analyze the stories and find out what are the drivers for the bondage and all. And then that group actually meets and understands say for example, if health is a theme, they try to understand within the health how their being in bondage is affecting it, or health becomes a reason for them to get into the bondage. Now they collect evidence from among the 15 people, and they also collect evidences beyond the 15 people in the village, and then they start discussing about it. So once they start discussing and they ask layers by layers the questions, they will understand that entire issue about the bonded labor. Now once their awareness increases, they will find more and more bonded labor into it, because now they are defining the bonded labor in a real sense and in a broadened way. For example, we were very surprised in one of the resource mapping tool, school was shown as a place school yes. Where bonded labor exists. We initially thought it is about children facing discrimination, but then we realized that it's about teachers who are not even getting the minimum wage. So in their resource mapping, they identified which are the areas which are the establishments which actually violate some of the laws related to bonded labor, and school was one of them. So therefore we'll see that the community actually evolves over the period in terms of awareness, and our aim is that can they act on it is the next step on it. So they first act on the local level. What are the minimum things they can go? So they write petitions to ensure that certain primary health center works well. So in that way they start questioning some of the old traditions, old forms of slavery, or getting into, or in factory premises, what are their rights and entitlements.
So you're giving voice to the most vulnerable, you're giving a platform, etc., you're raising awareness, etc. These are concrete interventions you're making. What are some of the main sort of outcomes or successes that you think you've had, achievements that you've had as an organization?
The challenge for us is it happens at 2-3 levels. One is at the micro level, which is at the community level. There are certain things where the actions are happening through various partners with whom we are supporting through technical. We feel that that is not enough, because even if you are able to rescue them, you will not be able to help them with any kind of an alternative scenarios and all. So what is important is to also to work at the various narrative platform, right, where there is culture, where we can bring the narratives of existence of bonded labor into various spaces. Like Government of India or any government, state governments, they would even say accept the fact that there is trafficking happening. They may even accept that child labor is there, but none of them actually accept the fact that bonded labor is there.
Okay.
Right? So that data on bonded labor is almost zero. Therefore, it has never got into the overall policy narrative as an issue that could be addressed.
Right.
In terms of it. So therefore, some of the things which we are doing is starting with whether we can actually reopen the Bonded Labor Act 1976. Not necessarily. Actually, that act is very progressive. Not necessarily to amend it, but actually, if it opens it up, at least there will be some kind of a discourse which will start happening on the bonded labor. Second is on the business and human rights. It's often the entire issue of bonded labor is still seen as a citizen versus state.
Yeah.
Right. Somewhere the corporates are getting away with it, and if you start looking at bonded labor from the lens of a supply chain, then every bonded labor is a supply chain of, I could easily say, around 50 to 60 big companies in each sector, right, who do not actually trace their supply chains towards the last tier of the supply chain. So therefore we are anchoring something called a Corporate Responsibility Watch, through which we actually analyze the top 100 companies about their business policies and all, and especially on supply chain, and facilitating them to disclose more and more on the supply chain front and all. In the last 7-8 months, I would say the Government of India has opened up in a big way. They have amended the National Voluntary Guidelines on Responsible Business with a new set of 2.0, and then they have also promised to come up with National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. So what we are trying to do is again bring that narrative of the bonded laborers or survivors, the thing, into the National Action Plan debate. So these are some of the things which we are going.
But it's quite a slow incremental process then. You don't get step change. So I'm going to ask a really unfair question just to round out our conversation. So you've just had an election in your country. It's a huge country, over 1 billion people. It's argued to be, the largest democracy in the world, etc. And I'm sort of reflecting on Amartya Sen's work in Development as Freedom, where he says there's no famine in a democracy. And, it's because there's voice, there's channels of expression, there's entry points to change government policy, and elected leaders have to rely on the votes of their people. So they couldn't possibly tolerate famine in their country because they wouldn't get re-elected. That's generally the argument. And there's sort of freedom of speech and press, etc., that would alert government officials and the public sphere that there's a problem. Now, if we translate that across to debt bondage and bonded labor, etc., where there's not yet maybe emerging formal recognition of the problem and reinstituting the Act from 1976, it sounds like there's some listening going on here. But is India an outlier? Because some of my own aggregate analysis on the prevalence of slavery shows that on average, ceteris paribus, around the world, the prevalence of slavery is lower in democracies. And I was wondering if Amartya Sen's little statement about famine also applies to the question of labor. And maybe India is an outlier at this stage, but there's hope for the future. So it's a very long-winded way to ask you, in the largest democracy in the world, is there hope for the future?
Of course, I think the primary thing is, I think there are flaws in democratic way of functioning, but solution to that is more democracy. Right? If that is the assumption with which we go, the idea is how to make the government accountable to the people, what SDG says, the people who should not be left behind.
Yeah.
I would say easily between 2000 and 2006, that period was the period where you could see a lot of rights-based legislations came into existence. especially in the later period of the thing and all, whether it is there. So therefore, I would say the idea is that how to make many of these things as entitlements for the communities, and how to ensure that so that the government is forced to look at this population as a vulnerable population, as a population that you are not giving them subsidies. It is their entitlements which you are going to fulfill. Till that narrative is becomes dominant, I think we will be facing this problem. And as far as the governance is concerned, governance is not yet, development is not the sole issue in the democracy, unfortunately. Right? Today, especially in a multicultural country like India, and over the change in the demography, etc., you will see that a lot of other issues are also becoming a major problem to it.
Mm-hmm. So just to add to that, I'd like to say, because we are wrapping up also, just something that came up during a ground level panel that we had organized. So where they looked at all the basic rights, like the ones that Pradeep just mentioned, and said that these are not going to be our demands. Because these are something that we are meant to have. And the government already has various policies in place that ensures that we get these basic rights to education, health, and livelihood, housing, all these. So their point was there are barriers that exist to these, and those must be addressed, because despite these being basic rights, people are not getting it. And that is why they get into situations of bonded labor. That is why they get into situations of vulnerability, violence, and of various forms. And so what are those barriers, and how can they be addressed? And all these answers will come through these engagement with the communities.
Well, I wish Praxis and the two of you all the best for continued hard work. And for now, may I thank Anusha and Pradeep for joining me on this episode of The Rights Track. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. You can find out more about our podcast at www.rightstrack.org. Funding for this series comes from the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab project, home to the world's leading contemporary modern slavery experts and first large-scale platform for ending modern slavery.